All right. So one of the topics that's somewhat hot off the press, we could say, is the Sefer Kaf Hachaim, which, of course, we have to mention that there's two important halachas from Kaf Hachaim. The other one from Sefer we've spoken about a number of times, and the importance of, if you want to understand minhagim, which are based on the Arizal, it's often important to look there, and there's a very nice new print of it. But then, of course, the more timely one is the other Kaf Hachaim, which you've emphasized in the past. The correct way to pronounce the author's name is Palachi. I think I'm saying it right. And we have the new.
I also think I'm saying it right, but I'm not sure either. But that's the best guess I have as of now. Yeah.
All right. So we have the Hagos of the Rebbe Rashab, and we spoke about a few things, and also Rabbi Brain published a few things that were interesting. And then you said you just bought a new copy, another edition of that Sefer. So let's pick some interesting topics from there to talk about.
All right. Should we back up a bit and just introduce what this kuntras
Sure.
that was released was for those that maybe aren't entirely up to date?
Sure.
So we'll take 2-3 minutes to tell the story of the release of the new Hagos of the Rebbe Rashab and Kaf Hachaim, an entirely new release, an entirely new chibur, you could say, of the Rebbe Rashab that was totally unknown to almost everyone until a month or two ago. I don't remember the exact date, but a month or so ago, without really much advance warning. Maybe I heard about it a day or two or three before. Someone spread a rumor that there's a new chibur, Hagos of the Rebbe Rashab and Kaf Hachaim, being released, and then a couple of days later, it showed up at Kahas, this new kuntras, Hagos, and because of a choice or Rebbe Rashab made a few years ago to brand everything as Teres Shalom, which, growing up, we knew the Sefer HaSichos Teres Shalom, but the Mamarim of the Rebbe Rashab are not called Teres Shalom. So I remember hearing many years ago that if you pay attention, you realize that the Mamarim of the Rebbe Marash are all called L'kutei Torah Teres Shmuel. So Teres Shmuel, Teres Shalom, there's they don't rhyme literally, but there's they match. There's a certain rhyming scheme there to calling it that, and the story went that the original plan, the original intention was to call all the Sfarim of the Rebbe Rashab Teres Shalom. So this was Sefer HaSichos Teres Shalom, and then the rest would be Sefer Mamarim Teres Shalom, or whatever the reason why. That's called the Kutei Torah. And then in the end, for whatever reason, the name Teres Shalom just stuck to the Sefer HaSichos. So growing up, as a bacher, we called the Sefer HaSichos Teres Shalom for short. But really, it's not Teres Shalom Sefer HaSichos, or I don't remember now what the order is. There's a tzaddik, whether it's Teres Shalom Sefer HaSichos, Sefer HaSichos Teres Shalom, but really, it's just supposed to be one chelik of the Teres Shalom. So that didn't work out at the time, but then in the last 10-15 years, Rebbe Rashab, I guess, decided to bring back that branding, so then when he was malak at all the tshuvas and nigla of the Rebbe Rashab, he called it Shalom. So tshuvas Teres Shalom. So now with this being released, they're calling it the Hagos and the Kaf Hachaim Teres Shalom. That's just as a footnote about the title Teres Shalom. So we were informed, we learned that this was released, Hagos of the Teres Shalom on the Kaf Hachaim. Now, as you said, when people say Kaf Hachaim Stam, they usually think of the set of Kaf Hachaim, which I've described to some people. It's sort of like the Iraqi Mishnah Brura, because it's sort of one of the Nesa Kalim. It's directly on the Shulchan Aruch, and it's up to date. It was printed relatively recently in the 1900s, early 1900s, 1910 or so, is when it was printed, which is B'chai the Rebbe Rashab, but towards the end of the Chai of the Rebbe Rashab. This Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Sefer of Iraq. And so like you said, one of the reasons why I think it's important for Lubavitchers and others to be familiar with it, among other reasons, is due to the shared Kabbalistic traditions, and it's a whole separate discussion. We can come back to it later. You can make a note of how there are a lot of Hanhagas in Chabad that are really part of a shared Kabbalistic heritage that encompasses many other communities, and sometimes there are things that we do that don't have a clear mucker, or don't have a clear articulation, don't have a clear gather, and if you want to understand them better, you actually have to look in other Svarim, Halachas Svarim, Dafka Svardish Svarim, that share that same tradition and discussed it in much greater detail. They had a much more lively tradition and history, going back to at least to the Chidah, if not earlier, of discussing these Kabbalistic Hanhagas in a oifen of Shak Levatari and Halacha, where in Eastern Europe or in Chabad in particular, there wasn't this tradition of being Isaac in Ziyanim. And you see when the Rebbe in particular, the Rebbe who had a big koch in being Mevar, Menhagim, and Prate Halachas, and Anhagis, I started paying attention. When you start paying attention, you realize how many such obscure Svardish Svarim the Rebbe is mitzayin to in Igris and in his Hagos relating to Sidurim, Slichas, etc. I've made different lists of very obscure Kabbalistic Svarim that the Rebbe uses repeatedly, and I think it's all comes down to this Nakuda of zooming out a bit, and if you're familiar with the larger corpus, you'll see that the Svardim are Isaac and are Mavar, a lot of Inyanim, that we just sort of have a very amorphous sense of this is something we do, we don't really know why. So it's fascinating to loop it back around. What's fascinating here is that the Rebbe Rashab essentially is already doing a version of that with this other Kaf Hachaim. But I was in the middle of saying that that's a mile of the Iraqi Kaf Hachaim. So now back to the Kuntres of Rebbe Rashab. It turns out that there's another Chibur called Kaf Hachaim that was from not 100 years earlier, maybe let's say 70 years earlier, 60 years earlier. Printed in the Tarfish Yuds, which is the 1850s, by this Reb Chaim Palachi, who was a Rav in Turkey, and not just Stam a Rav, but Mechaber B'nai Svarim, not just Mechaber B'nai Svarim, but as we see from this Kaf Hachaim, from other places, a tremendous chassid in the general traditional sense, a big someone who was following the Hagas al Pi Kabbalah and always looking to go the extra mile to the utmost in Hanhagas of Halacha and Prishas and Chumras and Chashashas. So a very, very, very spiritual person in that sense, filtered through Hanhagas, which is again something that's shared with Chabad, with Chassidus Chabad. Today it's maybe faded a bit, but a big component of being a chassid, of belonging to a group such as Chassidim, Chassidei Chabad, or in the larger sense, Mekubalim, across the world, is these extra anhagas, these extra chumras, these extra chashashis.
Interesting because obviously within the context of Chabad, I think we could say that of all the Rabbeim, the Rebbe Rashab is associated the most with chumras and those type of anhagas. But in general, if you zoom out, usually you associate all these chumras and being choshesh to all the shittas, etc., is usually much more associated with Ashkenazim than with Sfardim. But here it seems that at least those Sfardim who are strongly influenced by Kabbalah maybe are different.
That's an interesting point. I don't know how much you want to get off into that. Recently, I was reading a bit about the history of being choshesh to multiple shittas or combining multiple shittas, and it does have its own distinct Ashkenazi history. But interestingly, in where I was reading about it, it actually traced it to Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, Sefer Chassidim, another group of Chassidim, but in Ashkenaz in the 1100s or so, and that they at least articulated it as an idea. Maybe we don't have a lot of specific examples, but the idea of being choshesh to multiple shittas, even in Rishonim, even in Deis HaRishonim, sort of originated there. In the Gemara, you have it like in one or two or three places, I think, Beferish, where it says, let's be choshesh to multiple shittas. That's where I was coming from, I think, on that topic at the time, a few weeks ago.
And the Gemara, there's two things. First of all, I think we spoke about the Gemara of Yerei Shemam Yetzidei Shneim, which it's not descriptive. It just says about this particular, and I forgot who was choshesh to Shneim. And the other thing you have a lot of times in Gemara is Rav Papa, who says that you say both nuschos. You have a number of times Rav Papa is the one combining things.
Right. So I was thinking of the Yerei Shemam Yetzidei Shneim. All right. There's a few more examples of that, like you say. But the Yerei Shemam Yetzidei Shneim then became sort of the catchphrase, and you'll see in places out there, Shulchan Aruch, where he'll paraphrase that. And we'll say, Yerei Shamayim should do X, Y, and Z. Yerei Shamayim should do X, should do Y. And I think often it is to be sort of Yetzidei Shneim, whether it says so clearly or not. So in the Gemara, that's not the norm. It's seemingly more of the exception. So it's interesting to trace how so many psakim, so many piskei halachas that we take for granted today, or things that Alter Rebbe Paskins, for example, are really the Alter Rebbe combining shittas in new and original ways to create new psakim, a new bottom line, a new bottom line, a new hanhaga that never necessarily really quite existed in that particular form. So this whole derech halimud, this whole approach to halacha, can be, according to this argument, can be traced to Rabbi Yehuda Sefer Chassidim, that group of Chassidim that articulated the idea, and then Maram Rottenberg is the first one who, perhaps under this influence, we have prominent examples of how he started combining shittas in different ways, in interesting ways. But that's a whole different topic. But it is important to, when we talk about chumras and chashashis and hagas, it is important to have this sort of this historical perspective, this historical dimension of how certain approaches, certain patterns took hold and how they spread. So for this, back to the point you were making, it may have started in Ashkenaz, but then maybe it carried over to the Sephardim at some point, maybe in the 15, 16, or maybe 1700s. Maybe the Sephardim also sort of absorb that, and are also, when they have that midah of chassidus, of prishus, maybe they're also looking to start combining shittas and be chayshish to multiple shittas. Obviously, this has to be studied more systematically. So that's one version. Akapanim, that's one version of a chumrah of being a yirei shamayim, is seen as combining shit, and even today. The question is, you have the Haredim today, and the utmost, the what you would maybe even call the most extreme. Often, if you break down what they're doing, you can see they've been chayshish to multiple shittas of achreinim, poskim from the last 100 years, and they're following all the chumras of all the heintige poskim. And I guess the question to me individually, or the question to us as a community is, do we treat these later voices with the same chshivas, and do we have to be chayshish to all the shittas of the last 100 years, 200 years, 300 years? Because we also have this sense of, there's only really a way I interpret the statement about the Ruach HaKodesh, that all the Svarim are written by Ruach HaKodesh till the Shach and the Taz. The sort of way I've always interpreted it is that up until the Shach and Taz, Kamat, every Sefer is binding, and you have to be chayshish to their opinion. You can't just fife on the Shach and the Taz. But as time goes on, afterwards, maybe the number of people we're chayshish to and be considered to have binding opinions and have been written Ruach HaKodesh, maybe that keeps on narrowing and narrowing until we get to the last 100 years. And it could be there's certain psakim that are basic psakim that we will follow, but lav dafka we treat them the same way as being chayshish to the deis of Rishayim, being chayshish to the deis of the Shach and the Taz. So that's its own. When you think of it in this more general, when you zoom out in this way, so it's interesting to think about whether we should apply that system of being a Yirei Shamayim to today's halacha. But that's a separate discussion, but which is somewhat relevant. Back to Rebbe Rashab. So you mentioned Rebbe Rashab is known for chumrah. So yes, I think this fits very nicely into that. So people talking about whether this kuntres, these hagayos, whether they are surprising or they're not surprising. I think some people have articulated it as somewhat surprising. To me, upon seeing them, my summary would be that it's actually not very surprising. Both, as you mentioned, due to the general approach, tzugang of chumras, but also, as I explained before, with the Rebbe and on Hagas al Pi Kabbalah, that dafka at this point in time, dafka the Svardish Svarim had a much broader literature discussing different Hagas al Pi Kabbalah versus in Eastern Europe and in Chabad. There was much less to look at, to quote, to refer to. It was all sort of more Baal Peh. So it would make sense that if Rebbe Rashab, especially with having a koch in Chumras and in Hanhagas Bechlal, would find his way, would discover the Sefer, would take an interest in the Hanhagas and the Sefer. I didn't really define yet what the Sefer is, so we still have to do that. If I can
well, one more background thing that's perhaps important to note, and may even have enough commitment in understanding certain things, is that the way the Sefer was published, the people who worked on it, they understood that it was written while the Rebbe Rashab was on his travels, based on the fact that he noted that certain Svarim were not available to him. But I believe it was David Aladart in Haras Urim, or maybe someone else or somewhere else pointed out that it may well be that it was written while the Rebbe Rashab was in Rostov, and the reason he didn't have the Sfarim was because many of the Sfarim stayed behind in the Lubavitch.
Right. So there is that lack of clarity as to what the exact story here is with the time and the place. People were also trying to determine it. Those who have an expertise in the Rebbe Rashab's Ksav and have the sense, they believe they can identify the Ksav by the year, had different opinions, but it didn't seem like that was conclusive. So I don't have a strong personal opinion about it myself. Apparently the Sefer is very thick, but also very compact, so it was meant to sort of be, I don't know if pocket size is the right word, but somewhere in those whereabouts in that vicinity was a more compact Sefer. By the way, you see the Kutras Hagoyas Torah Shalom, they only included the Seifim that the Rebbe Rashab commented on, so I don't remember how many Hagoyas there are, whether it's 30 or 40 or 50, so they only quoted the Seifim and the Hagoyas under them. So it's a pretty slim kuntras, but really it's depending on the print or whatever. But it's like a 500-600 page sefer. If I'm not mistaken, the span of the sefer that the Rebbe Rashab's Hagoyas cover is about like 200 pages maybe out of the sefer. So about a third or a quarter, the first third or quarter of the sefer. Right. So there's different ways of looking at it, but it's important. People saw me. I was looking at the Kaf Hachaim, the original. I got a new edition of this Kaf Hachaim of Reb Chaim Palachi. I was looking at it, and people were commenting, "Oh, you're looking at the Sefer itself. The Rebbe Rashab's Hagoyas are just a small amount." So I said, for perspective, we should realize that clearly the Rebbe Rashab read 200 pages, and he didn't have a comment on every page. He had a comment on every 10 pages, every 15, 20 pages, whatever the exact number is. But clearly he was going through it, at least the first, like I said, first quarter, first third of the Sefer. It's even the new edition that I have is also more of a compact size. And maybe they kept to that format, but weiter, it's 500-600 pages, and so by that metric, it's definitely, by today's standards, it's I don't know if hefty is the right word, but it's not a small sefer. It's a full sefer.
Okay, so let's get into a little bit some of the actual teichen of the sefer and the Rebbe Rashab's Hagoyas.
Okay, one more thing, I guess, right before that is just to help explain and define what the sefer is. So, as was alluded to, Chaim Palachi wrote this sefer called Kaf Hachaim. His name, of course, is Chaim, and the word Chaim appears in I don't know if it's every sefer that he wrote, but in a big number of the Sfarim that he wrote have the name Chaim in it. So that's probably the main reason why it has the name Chaim in it, and it's probably some remez and kavana that if you follow this is the path of life, but it's essentially a guide. Like the third of the sefer that the Rebbe Rashab covered is a guide to going through the day of a Yom Choil, and then the next big chunk of the sefer is a guide to going through Shabbos. So it's sort of, and it's part of a genre, again, that was not so familiar necessarily in Eastern Europe, although you had the Sefer Shalah, which is a version of that. Look at the Shalah, and there's Maseches Chulin, which sort of takes you through the Anhagas of a weekday. There's Maseches Shabbos, which takes you through the Anhagas of Shabbos. Maseches Psachim. Took me, I'm embarrassed to say, it was relatively late in the game when I realized that the most that I came across the Shalah was in databases. You search a database for something in the Shalah, Maseches Chulin pops up, Maseches Psachim, Maseches Shabbos. Without checking, I guess he has Pschadushim or Ha'aris, Lafi Masechtas. No, it's the Choil is a Masechta, Shabbos is a Masechta, Pesach is a Masechta, and it's the Anhagas for those parts of the Jewish life. So the Shalah maybe is the closest we have, and Mitaka have from the Frierdiker Rebbe, that the Alter Rebbe before Chassidus would have been using the Shalah as his guide to Hanhagas and Vizach Tzafir and how to conduct oneself. So the Shalah is part of that tradition, but after the Shalah, it doesn't seem like after the Shalah there was Kitzer Shalah, which is its own interesting discussion. And had its own chidushim that it added in some of the anhagas that we have till today. When they're sourced to Kitzer Shalah, but the Kitzer Shalah was written by someone else. Otherwise, it doesn't seem like there was a sefer that came after that Jews in Eastern Europe and Chabad would be using. Whereas in the Sephardic world, there was more of that. The most infamous one is of course the Sefer Chemdas Yamim, which we're not getting into. But Chemdas Yamim was very popular for this reason, because it was sort of a guide that walks you through the tkufas of the year, and depending on the skill of the author, you can, if the author writes it with a varmkai, with an excitement, so mamish hypes you up and gets you into the mood, it gets you into the mode for Shabbos, for Yom Tif, etc. So Chemdas Yom was famous like that. So this Kaf Hachaim is another version, another variation of that. Not so much mamish deep. I would say Chemdas Yom has a lot more of like kavanas al pi Kabbalah and tefillas al pi Kabbalah. Kaf Hachaim is more about the very practical and the pitfalls and mechshaylas to avoid. So it's a bit more down to earth in that sense. And it's but it does belong generally to that genre of taking the person who wants to firzich correctly in the best way possible and walking them through the steps. And so then it's divided more individually into individual chapters of Chveis, Shachris, Mincha, but there are many more chapters to it. The morning, the evening, etc. So that's the sefer the Rebbe Rashab is looking at. So like we said, it was printed in the 1850s or so, and we don't know when the Rebbe Rashab is looking at it. It could be anywhere between the 1880s at earliest, Tafish Mems at earliest, or 1890s, etc., 1900s, 1910s. We don't know for sure. But somewhere in those whereabouts, whether it was when he was traveling, like you said, or whether it was in Rostov, we don't know. But like I said, I don't see it as surprising. In retrospect, this makes a lot of sense to me and very much fits in with how I see and understand the Rebbe Rashab. So,
Okay.
like you said, you want to get into some of the specifics. I don't actually have the kuntras in front of me. Do you have the kuntras in front of you, or no?
No, I don't have it in front of me. I did get hold of it. Even in Chicago, they're not selling it yet, but I did get hold of it. But I like it in front of me. I mean, one of the topics that in the Sefer that caught my attention, which we spoke about briefly, was about the concern of the tefillin slipping out of place.
Right. So is that something? I mean, that's a topic that you can share more about. I can give you the floor for a couple of minutes if you want.
No, but better you choose a topic or something that caught your attention. We'll go from there.
Okay, no, I can summarize that because it is an interesting topic, and you can comment on it as necessary. So that's an example, a very interesting example. But before I say that, I just want to point out, like I said, the kuntras only has the seifim that the Rebbe Rashab commented on, which ultimately is a small number, a small percentage. And I do recommend, for those trying to better understand even what the Rebbe Rashab is doing, I would recommend getting a hold of the full sefer and reading through certainly at least the simanim that the Rebbe Rashab did comment on, just to give you a better context, better flavor of what the Kaf Hachaim, what Rebbe Chaim Palachi is doing, and then you can understand where the Rebbe Rashab is choosing to chime in. So in that sense, the kuntras doesn't fully do it justice. I understand the choice, I understand the decision. What's the point of making the kuntras much larger with seifim that the Rebbe Rashab isn't commenting on? But I do think if you want to take it seriously and understand it seriously, not just, meaning there are those that just got excited, oh, the Rebbe Rashab has ha'ara on this Inyan halacha, this Inyan halacha, we know the website Ask the Rav immediately went and started updating all the pages on the website that had anything to do with any of the ha'aris and the Kaf Hachaim, and said, oh, Shuvra Isi, Nagas, Tereshlam, Kaf Hachaim. So there are a number of, like, I would call them sort of marginal, a number of them are sort of like marginal details in daily halacha that are still negaya, that are still discussed till today, where now the Torah Shalom moved the ball a little bit on a number of topics. So I think I lost a bit of my train of thought there, but so there's that aspect to it. But then there's I guess this is the point I was trying to make, is sort of getting the general sense of what the sefer is doing, and why the Rebbe Rashab is reading it, and why the Rebbe Rashab is adding you could say his 2 cents, if that's a respectful thing to say, to a particular seifim. So in other words, if you want to be like the Rebbe Rashab, if you just want to get the bottom line of prat about tefillin, a prat about tzitzis, so then you could read it that way. If you want to see things from the perspective that Rebbe Rashab was seeing them, I would recommend taking a look directly at the Sefer, and Adrabah, maybe that means all the other Seifrim, certainly in those 200 pages, all the other Seifrim that Rebbe Rashab didn't comment on, maybe it's a haskama, that it's glot, everything's glot, everything is great, it's all shutter v'kayim, and so I would recommend that. I did hear that a bunch of Bachrim did come to one of the farm stores, and they were asking for the Kaf Hachaim, and they were asking for the wrong one, and that store didn't even have a copy of this one. I went into a different farm store, and I happened to see this edition. The edition that I have is the Shuvi Nafshi edition. It was printed in Tafshinai and Gimel, so it is a very nice edition just of the Sefer Kaf Hachaim itself. They redid it, and they did a lot of ha'aris on it as well, comparing it to all the other svarim of the Kaf Hachaim, and sometimes checking his sources when he quotes the sources to see if the sources that he quotes say what he says they say. So a very sort of relatively thorough job going through the Kaf Hachaim. So that would be the best edition that I would recommend. Of course, it's brand new. It's oisius meiris einayim, very pleasant read. I think, like I said, it's actually also in a more compact. It's not a full-size sefer. It has more of a compact size in terms of height. Anyway, so that's that point. So as we mentioned, for example, one Indian in the sefer, one Indian I don't remember what the sefer itself says, but in the Haggadah Teres Shalom on the sefer is about the size of the tefillin and placing the tefillin on the head. So if I may acknowledge that you have raised this point before, it's an issue that you've raised. Obviously, different people's hairline situation is different. We know that Rebbe's hairline was also such that he didn't have hair in the front. And the Rebbe himself was asked, and I think the Mustafa Metzayin to it there, the Rebbe was asked, or it's in some pictures, you look at the Rebbe's tefillin, and it doesn't look like it's mamish exactly in the center, down the center of the nose, between the eyes, which to my mind, I haven't dug into it, I imagine you have. Of course, I would always tend to challenge and say, maybe being medayik to the extreme that it should be in the center, maybe that it's also on Haga. Who's the first one that said that you have to make yourself meshuggah to make sure that it's exactly in the middle, and if it goes a tiny bit out of or turns this way, turns that, what's the first marker for it?
So from my knowledge, a few things come to mind. First of all, going backwards, there was a couple of years ago, an up and back in Harasa B'Urim, a little bit excessive, if I recall correctly, about using a mirror. Obviously, the first Mekoyer that I'm aware of using a mirror is the story, I believe, of Alter Rebbe, that he took the cover of the Shmek Tabak box and he used that as a mirror.
Right. Which isn't a mirror, by the way. I'm saying, I was actually just reading an article about mirrors, not to get too off topic, but the mirrors as we know them were invented, the glass, that are designed with a glass and a metal alloy behind the glass, famous mashal about whether the window is transparent or there's silver blocking, right? That whole invention is only, I think, the 1600s, very relatively late. So all the mirrors we have in our houses, and what?
It's interesting you're mentioning that, because I recently learned the Rashi, which I have here in front of me. I'm trying to find it in the Chulin, where Rashi, the Gemara is talking about shechting with different items, and Rashi over there says, I think it's stuff you Tezvav, somewhere there. Rashi brings the French word for a mirror. It has an extra D in it, mirdor or something like that.
Very interesting.
Which is the old, it seems like in Old French there was an extra D in there. So I was actually wondering and trying to figure out, I didn't really get anywhere to understand what exactly mirrors meant in the time. Oh, here it is. The Gemara says, it's in the Chulin Daf Tazayin with base, where the Gemara says, Rav Papa Mechatech Bakir V'Dogim, the Zigi. So Rashi says Zigi means clear belaz, which that's in English also. Kein mare shakoirin miradur rare. I'm not sure exactly. Mem yud Reish Dalet Vav Yud Yud Reish. So I was trying to figure out what exactly the mirrors that Rashi was referring to looked like. I didn't really get much clarity, but in the context, he's trying to refer to something clear. But you're saying that the silver that Alter Rebbe used was not the mirror the way we know it.
Right. So the history of using mirrors of reflections is, in the past, people would just use pieces of metal that were relatively reflective, or they looked in the water, which is somewhat reflective, etc. So they looked around for the most reflective items that were available, that were around. But when we say mirror today, we mean produced in a very specific way that's very identifiable as a mirror. That mirror that we are familiar with today, that's a mirror b'shem b'hei hayidiyah, without, we're speaking in English, not in Hebrew. But if there was a hei hayidiyah, the mirror, that was apparently invented, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was in Italy in the 1600s, and from there the technology snuck and got to France, and from there it spread across the world. So this has many nafkaminas. The article was coming out from the angle of how obsessed we all are today with our faces and how our faces appear, and the filters on the apps, and the people that are doing work on their faces, etc., etc. So it was just tracing the idea of being self-aware of our appearance and how much our face plays a part in our lives. And we know there are Yiddish Sipurim of Gedolim that walked into a palace and they saw a mirror for the first time, and they saw themselves for the first time, and they were impressed by this very chashuv looking Yid. Right? They think they say it about different people. Maybe Akiva Eger is one of the names they say. They're very impressed with this very derhoibin looking Yid. They wanted to get to meet them, to get to know them. So that article was interesting to me because it does tie in, and even al pi halacha, there's a shaila, can men look in a mirror, can they not look in a mirror? And actually I saw in the Kaf Hachaim, Rebbe Chaim Palachi, he actually gets a little bit not into the mirror question per se, but into questions of male grooming and how males groom themselves, and the more you see yourself, the more you want to groom yourself. So it's an interesting topic. So you're mentioning that mirrors come up l'gabe tefillin. So I just want to point out that the Alter Rebbe didn't have a mirror. He was looking for the closest metal item in his possession that was somewhat reflective, and that was the silver top of a tobacco box. I think the distinction is somewhat important.
Okay, my vote is like this. That it's actually interesting because in this area there's a big difference between other Chassidim and Chabad, because by other Chassidim is very stark angenommen the psak of the Tzanzerov, that Mokum Yesh Baruch Laniach Beis Tefillin means side by side, and that the Tefillin beferish don't have to be, exactly Bein Einecha.
Down the middle. Yeah.
And Ad Kedei Kach, that if I recall correctly, in Piskei Teshuvos, which I think is somewhat representative of how things are done in the
world,
in the broader Chassidish world. In the prim of the Sefer, he basically says that tefillin don't have to be in the middle, and then in the footnotes he brings, there are shittas. But leidach, so
that itself is interesting, just for Lubavitchers to get some perspective. That,
right, but Alter Rebbe in the Siddur actually writes something which I think is often misunderstood. But the Alter Rebbe writes over there, he brings a raya from the Gemara that there has to be beini nechamamush, and the part that's misunderstood. The raya that Alter Rebbe brings is that the Gemara says over there Menachos that. Kadesh v'hoyev v'kivyacha miyamin, and Shema v'hoyim shmoyim mismoil. And the question is, does miyamin and mismoil mean the yamin habayis? Because the Alter Rebbe says that, but tefillin the Rashi, or according to Rashi, it's only a chut hasayra, whatever the lashon is, because he holds that yamin means the yamin haroish and smoil means the smoil haroish. If you need two parshas the yamin haroish and two parshas the smoil haroish, so that's how the Alter Rebbe Paschal in the Siddur, that it has to be exactly.
That's what's mechayev, that should be in the middle, because if the whole tefillah moves over to the right, then come to us that all the parshas are liyamin, or all the parshas are l'smoil. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. That's the psak of the Alter Rebbe in the Siddur. What's misunderstood about it is two things. In Chabad, it's common to say, and I believe. I recall correctly, even in the new Hagos Kaf Hachaim, in the footnotes, whoever published it writes as much, that the Hakpada is only in Tefillin the Rashi, not in Tefillin the Rabbeinu Tam. And I believe, and my friend, I think you know him, Rebbe Lieberman from London, has spoken about this a number of times, that it's a gross misunderstanding of the Alter Rebbe. First of all, even if you were to accept that opinion, the whole vort is that in Rabbeinu Tam's Tefillin, Shema v'hoyim shemoy the other way around. So at the very most, the tefillin can, lefi that mahalach, at the very most, the tefillin can be off-centered a tiny amount and only in one direction, not in the other. But the Gufa Shel Davar, the whole thing is a moot point because the reason Alter Rebbe quotes Rashi is because the Raya from the Gemara is only according to Rashi. He holds that Yamin and Smoil means Yamin HaRosh. Mashenkin the Fir Ben Atam, Yamin and Smoil means Yamin Habayis and Smoil Habayis. Mainly, there's no Raya from the Gemara there, but whether or not, there's no reason to say that Rebbe Atam is Chaylik on the Etzem Yisoid, that the tefillin have to be Bein Necha Mamish. The reason Alter Rebbe says B'tefillin the Rashi is because the whole Raya you only have a Raya from the Pirush HaSugya of Rashi, and Rebbe Atam translates the Gemara differently, but there's no reason to assume that the halacha of the tefillin being bein necha should be any different by tefillin that are bein tam. But b'chalifin, that's one aspect of it. That according to Alter Rebbe in the Siddur, which from calling the psakim of the Siddur were not angenommen by other chassidim outside of Chabad.
They often struggle to understand what the Siddur is and that it exists and that it's separate from, it's better, that to us it's superior to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. They seem incapable of processing the...
I've seen many comical examples of that. I was once bris where the baby was born after Tzeisa Kechovim before the Zman of Menatam, and he made the bris on the 8th day, and there was a Satur Yid that was very disturbed by it. After Rebbe Paskin Tzaka Menatam in the Shulchan Aruch. Anyway, but then there's another...
yeah.
No, but there's another point in the tefillin, which that's also Rebbe Rashab and Anago is talking about both points, is the height of the tefillin. One is the sense being centered bein necha, and the other is not slipping down below the hairline, which obviously are very related, because once tefillin are not being tight in place, the context over there is that if a person has big tefillin, which makes the circumference of the ritzuas around the head smaller, so it stays in place. It's harder for it to stay in place, which actually Rabbi Brian pointed out in his website that the Haggadah finishes off with the words "V'hurachim mechaper oven," which the Metziim La'or understood to mean something along the lines of that even if the tefillin are big, it's so important that the tefillin should be big. That but in context, it's much more seems much more logical to touch that he writes there about Bifrat the Seifrim Bizman Hazeh, that nowadays it's hard to find. Nowadays, meaning in the time of the Rebbe Rashab, it was hard to find parshas that were written small enough to make the tefillin smaller. That should be a kosher lechatchila ksav. So he writes Bifrat the Seifrim Bizman Hazeh v'hurachim mechaper, that sort of lighter what was conformed with the Seifrim, that's the v'hurach mechaper. But the maskan of the Rebbe Rashab is that if a person's head, the person's situation is such that his tefillin are slipping out of place, then it would be better for him to wear a smaller tefillin. I'm not, how to actually practice this today in Chabad, that's already beyond my pay grade, but...
I have a couple of ha'aras on the previous build-up, but before I jump back to that, I just want to comment on the last thing you said about their Havana versus your Havana. So I was just talking to someone about this kuntris on Shabbos, and he expressed that at the end of the kuntris, they sort of have a kitzer, a summary, a sikkim of all the chidushi halachas, all the chidushim that the Rebbe Rashab has in this kuntris, lafi their Havana. And even this person was randomly expressing that it bothered him. There's so much of their Havana that's sort of being injected. To surprisingly, I don't know if it's surprising or not, but a relatively large amount of the time they are applying they're reading a certain reading into the text, like you said over here. How do you read the V'hurachim mechaper oven? So they're reading it a certain way, and you would read it another way. But then presumably in their sikum, when they write the bottom line, it probably will emphasize even more dafka the way they read it. So you can't really rely on if you hold yourself as someone who's capable of doing your own reading and disregarding and putting aside their footnotes just to see how you read it yourself and how you understand it yourself. You trust your own ability to read it. So that kind of person would do well to remember that you don't want to necessarily rely on their sikumim, for example, for that reason. So it is important to emphasize that while it's a tremendous contribution, typing up the Haggais and writing Haris on them, There are many cases. Anyone who is really Isaac, who has an Isaac in these inyanim, well, chances are they will disagree, and they actually read it critically. Chances are they will disagree on the Havana of words, phrases, how to read it, what phrase connects to what, like in this case. So we want to credit them for starting the discussion, but it doesn't mean that this is a davar shalim and the final word, even on what the Rebbe Rashab said and what he meant and what the takeaway and what the upshot, is that the expression? What the upshots are of the.
It's like in halacha, you have like sometimes the achronim mutzazech on something. It says in kitzuk rosh if it's takel b'shtumus with pshat in the rosh or so.
Right. To back up a bit, you mentioned about the Alter Rebbe. First of all, it's interesting to mention that there is a Chassidish Maisa that I think is brought in a number of our Makaitis, maybe all Tamidim of Goreinim, I don't remember. Today we have bigger mumchim, we have Yingalayat, Ramamish mumchim, and every single strain of Sipurei Chabad that came to us from every single channel, and be able to put them all together and to compare the different kursais. In that sense, I'm still a bit more old school. When I was a kid, it was Perlov, Falakan, Chitrik, maybe Duchman, and that was about it. Today there's 20 sources instead of 4.
We're still waiting for the Sifri Asher B'Ksuvin for Reb Shmuel Super to become the gold standard, but
we're waiting, right? So he's gonna, which is based on, right, from one of the sources from the Duchman channel, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Tovia
Belkin is a
right, so Tovia Belkin, who was Makabel from Mordechai Duchman, who is a parallel source to Shnei Zalman Duchman, which is the Shema Eisen, and to Chaim Elio Mishalovin, if I'm not mistaken, which is another. So there's, even within the Duchman line, there's a few branches. And so when I was a Bachar and I did most of my reading, we couldn't imagine how many more channels there were. So my Gerus the Yankas is still limited, even though I try to broaden my mind and read all the different things that are published, which is itself hard to do, hard to keep up. So there was definitely a story, and I can't tell you exactly which Makar it is, but there's a story about how it was they were Megala to the Alter Rebbe. This is mamish, I'm collapsing the story without getting into the pratim, but they were Megala to the Alter Rebbe that every time he is in Mizbainin and says the word Echad and Shema, Epis Min HaShamayim, they cause his tefillin to turn off to the side. This Epis, like I said, I'm just collapsing the story, but it's a very interesting story. And now that we're talking about the topic of tefillin, Alter Rebbe Shitta, it would be interesting to go back to revisit that story and to try to understand how that fits into the picture. And I think part of maybe what's implied by the story is that, like, okay, if that's what's happening, so there's a bit more of acceptance. I think also, I mean, part of the story is it's like a criticism or something, but like it's like a, Min HaShamayim, the Alter Rebbe is getting a little bit of a, I don't want to say, you have to be very delicate with our words, but it's like
the emphasis, if you want to,
yeah.
I don't have to see if I can find it quickly in front of me here, but the emphasis that the issue of the tefillin slipping is already in the Shulchan Aruch. And what I remember now is that the Alter Rebbe brings that B'etzem al pi halacha, if your tefillin slip out of place, when you put them back, you have to make another bracha. But the minhag is not to, and they bring up as a reason, almost like a limud chus or yishuv on the minhag. But it's not fresh in my mind. But if I recall correctly, it's like almost like azoy the minhag. And now, okay, you have a reason for the minhag, you don't have a minhag. But in other words, this idea of like this how do you call it? This sort of not being clear how to deal with this issue of the tefillin not staying in place is already an old issue.
But I would just say, keep in mind that slipping could also mean different things depending on the context. When we say slipping, the way our bottom are designed, the way our ritzuos are designed today, at most it's a little this way, a little that way. For all we know, they had worn out ritzuos and they had much larger spaces in the bottom, and maybe slipping means that it's going all the way here and going all the way there. So you can't be anachronistic. You can't just project our reality onto their reality. I didn't go through the sugya, and you've gone through the sugya a bit more than me. But I would just warn to keep that in mind, that you can't just take for granted that we're talking about the same movement. There's dargas here. For all we know, my guess, without looking at it, would be that Shulchan Aruch is talking about a much bigger slip, where it's mamish, nowhere near beinei necha. And my guess would be that it's a later chumrah, a later chash, and sensitivity to make sure that it's mamish. And by the way, you mentioned about the tzanz are saying that it's side by side. Right? I think the Kabbalah that do it, I think they do front and back, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, no.
Are they still?
I think the tzanz is I think if I recall correctly in the sugya is mechudesh, but here is the tzanz of by the Chassidim is a very chashuv basic.
So that knocked that chash out of the. Interesting. So. There's a lot, this is its own, if we sat down and we made it a sugya, you could turn it definitely into a nice hour share for sure. And that gets me to one more point I wanted to make, which is that I think it's very chaval, as bar mitzvah bachrim, the way halacha is taught, bichlal, kol minei pratei halacha are taught, and b'frat tefillin to bar mitzvah bacher, even just the prat that you said about the two parshias needing to be to the right of the rosh, and two parshias being to the left of the rosh, which I think can be tied into maybe the Kabbalistic sense of the tefillin, the dalad moichen. To my mind, my guess would be that the dalad parsha is being connected, the dalad moichen, and being mamshich dalad moichen milamayla, the dalad moichen of Kabbalah, into the dalad moichen of the person. It probably follows that that's connected to the idea of making sure that you have two here and two here. It's probably connected the physical moichen, which itself could then be almost something that you, all other topic of hisbainos and visualizing and picturing. If you're putting on tefillin, you want to have a kavanah of tefillin. It doesn't have to be a sophisticated arizal kavanah of tefillin, but just on a parshat level to be mechavan that, okay, there are four parshias, and the four parshias are connected to dal meichin de lamayla, and you have to remember which parsha is which would be considered pretty basic, and then to what are the dalad moichin in the head, and how does Chassidus describe where the dalad moichin are, just to sort of picture and visualize how, I think on the most pashita level, that's, again, like I said, it's a whole separate discussion of hisbainos and kavanis al pi Chassidus. But I think that's all relevant. I think it all ties together. The anhagas, the hakpadas are tied to the ruchnias anyanim, and the ruchnias anyanim are tied to our personal spiritual experiences. So I think it's very unfortunate that you come to a bar mitzvah bach or even older, and you just tell them on a very pashut level, oh, the tefillin have to be in the middle, or Rashi, yeah, but there's no context, there's no meaning, there's no significance. So it's simple enough to make yourself meshuggah to put it in the middle, but why are you making yourself meshuggah? Why are we arguing about the mirror? Why are we having this whole debate about the mirror, right? I think in the whole debate about the mirror, did anyone ever, at any point in the discussion, ever take a break to discuss the ruchnias? Or was all like the technical sheba technical? Yes, the technical Indian, that the tefillin should be in the middle, and now the technical shaila as to whether how OCD could be able to use the term in a borrowed sense. How OCD should we be about checking where the tefillin are? It's like the technical sheba technical as opposed to the where's the nishmas advarim? What's the meaning of it? And again, it's not a sugya that I've delved into, but that's what comes to mind.
So definitely an interesting perspective, which I don't think I've sort of considered in this context before. Obviously, what comes to me to mind is l'chayra, a very basic hisbonenus in tefillin, in addition to, of course, what's brought in Shulchan Aruch and even printed in the Tilas Hashem Siddur, that you have by Menachos Tefillin, Shasivan HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lichted Dal Parsha Yisrael, etc. There's the hisbonenus in Tanya in Perek Mem Aleph, where I have it next to me. I'm just reading the lashon in Tanya Perek Mem Aleph is derech prat the hisbonenus derech prat b'tefillin batel v'lekol b'chinas chachmaso ubinosis b'nashe lekis b'chinas chachmaso ubinosis shel Ensof Baruch Hu hamulabosh is derech prat b'parshis kadosh v'hoyikaviyacha. So it seems like there's some sort of derech prat understanding of what the four moichin and the four parshas represent, that at least ostensibly is supposed to be Shavah Chol Nefesh.
Right, and here the Alter Rebbe is referring rather specifically along the way I was describing to at least two of them, the Chacham and the Bina of the person, the Chacham Bina of the Eibishter, and the two, so there's three. There's the Chacham Bina L'mayla, Chacham Bina of the person, and the two parshas that he mentions. And it would be interesting to go search elsewhere to see whether all four parshas are discussed elsewhere and described in this way. But essentially, what you're quoting from Tanya is along the lines of what I was saying. But I don't feel like it's explained in a concrete way, in the sense that the halachas of tefillin and the pratim of tefillin are directly enmeshed and integrated with the Kabbalistic and the Hasidic ideas. It's just it's a bunch of random separated details. So that's what I'm being worried about. It's something we could probably talk about at length in another occasion about how to go about learning these things in a what I would consider to be a concrete way, sai begashmias, sai and understanding where the halachas and the chashashas and the chumash are coming from, sai understanding the Kabbalistic tie-ins, putting it all together, as opposed to what I like to call achtos between the inyanim, and not pirud. That there's a physical tefillin, that's like one sugya, and then there's a thing in Tanya, that's another sugya. To try to merge it.
I won't mention that
together.
It's directly related to what you're saying, but I think there is a little bit of a tension acknowledged even within Chabad. The famous story of what the Rebbe Rashab said to the Frierdiker Rebbe about the difference between him and the Pillar Paracha, like what's coming first is the chumras in halacha there to serve chassidus, or is the chassidus there to serve the chumras in halacha? And the there's two different. Obviously, for certainly, I would say the Rebbe's mahalach is that very much an emphasis on that it's all a Torah achas and miksha achas and miraya echad nitnu, etc. But I think that there might still be place for two different perspectives and in the same shabbos.
Well, there's a different category of chumras where we are very machmir in certain things because hayos mevil that elikos sich ablegen by the person and certain chashas, certain chumras, we're concerned that it's going to be metamtim, it's going to be megashim. So a lot of Reb Hillel's chumras weren't like when he was in Nizar and Shatnez, it wasn't necessarily about the kavana ruchnius of Shatnez. It was about that if I get exposed to Shatnez, it's going to, because his soul is so sensitive, it's going to be mazik, his sensitive soul, and then he won't be able to relate to Elikos in the way that he was able to until now. So that's, there's sort of like it's step one and step two. But when we talk about tefillin, I don't think, I certainly don't recall that this was taught this way. I don't think it's taught this way, even though Chassidus says it a million times, that tefillin is about being mamshech Elikos into your meichin. And so, sit down with a kid and say, obviously there are different kids on different levels, but let's say there's a kid who's a bit more advanced, a bit more spiritually sensitive, and has a spiritual meshicha. Sometimes you say, obviously you also don't want to drive a kid crazy, you have to say it in the appropriate way for the appropriate age. But the inyan of tefillin is, we talk about Elikos, chassidus, and to connect with Elikos, and to be mamshech Elikos. So tefillin is one of the most powerful ways to be mamshech Elikos into a person is by wearing kosher tefillin, and mehudadik tefillin, you bring mamshech Elikos into your mayach. And chassidus we say, mayach chachma, mayach habina. The Eibusha has a mayach chachma, and a mayach habina has the sviras chachma, sviras habina, which corresponds to mayach chachma, mayach habina, and the parshias correspond to the sviras lamayla. You bring mamshech, however you want. Maybe there's a better way to explain it. Maybe there are more details that could be added to it, but to explain it as one piece, which is literally what our hashkafa and our havana is. It's just for some reason it's not.
I was saying befrat hayos that this is a chumra that Alter Rebbe in the Siddur, and Yodua what the Shara Koilel writes that many of the chumras in the Siddur are there to be choishes for the way the inyanim are on pipnimius.
So that's what I'm saying. You're gonna come to a kid and not explain any of this, and then just make him a sugar that the tefillin should be in the middle, and there's never any additional spiritual context given, when it could very well be that the entire chumrah, per my speculation, or per my, I like to call it my pre-Havana. I didn't learn the sugya, but this is my pre-Havana going into it, and what I'll be looking for when I get into it. So per that pre-Havana, that's probably the yisoid of the chumrah. That would be my guess. If you're telling me that Alter Rebbe articulates it for the first time in such a way in the Siddur, then it's pretty clear to me that there's a ruchnistic dimension to it. And like I said, look at Chassidus and you see the importance of tefillin, or even why did Rebbe, to go off into mivtza tefillin and how mivtza tefillin is done today, etc., etc. Why did the Rebbe choose mivtza tefillin? Why people say, why tefillin, not a talis, this, that, but definitely part of the reason is the spiritual significance and the spiritual power and the spiritual effect that tefillin has on a person. So even if you're engaging with tefillin, it probably is helpful to have this spiritual havana, have the spiritual understanding. It's not just I don't want to be mean, but it's not just for social media, not just for a picture. There's some spiritual theory behind it, and certainly for ourselves, and certainly if we're going out of the way to put it on other people, to at least have that spiritual meaning and significance at the forefront of our minds, pun or not pun intended, which is what tefillin is, about our minds. So it would be appropriate to have a more mindful understanding of what tefillin is, whether it's with Psalm, whether it's ourselves, whether it's even a bar mitzvah boy. I feel like that is lost, and like I said, I think it's negeh to even to the pratei halachas, the pratei chumras. So often everything just gets turned into Kabbalah's oil, very disconnected from any Havana, and there's no reason. Obviously in Chabad we love Kabbalah's oil, but in Chabad we also love understanding the premius of stuff. So for the Kabbalah's oil to disconnect the practical halacha from the premius doesn't make sense to me, doesn't sit well with me at all. So that's just, I think, an important point to make. So even this whole discussion, you want to take it all technically, this, that, turning this way, turning that way, big, small. Before we care about that, let's first understand why we care, why it's negeh, why it's spiritually important.
Yeah, okay, so it's interesting you're saying it that way. Just maybe to wrap up and to not on the a little bit, is that even though it's true that in Chabad we certainly, for the most part, embrace and take on Minhagei Arizal, there is also in Chabad more than in those Svardish Sfarim that we mentioned, certain Hanhagas al Pi Kabbalah, which is only for Yechidei Skula. And just to mention a couple that are specifically related to tefillin. So first of all, in the Paskim, there's a major discussion, maybe you could call it controversy, about if you should put on the tefillin shal yad and put on and take off the tefillin shal yad sitting or standing. And the Zohar that it should be sitting. It's better to be standing. And the Maisa in Chabad, to state the Ferish, I don't remember if it's in Sefer Minhagim or somewhere else, that the Minhag Beis Harav, but not Hirol Rabim, that the Rabbeim, they take on and put on tefillin sitting down, but the Hirol Rabim is to do it standing up. Another inyan in tefillin is the inyan of tefillin of Shmoshe Rabbah, which is also very much connected to what we just said, because the way there's machloiches in Achronim what the Shmoshe Rabbah tefillin is. In the Chabad, I think it's based on the Tzemach Tzedek, or maybe even earlier. The Masorah is that the Shmoshe Rabbah tefillin is to have that the Seder HaParshias is backwards from Rashi instead of Kaddish. But there are other Achronim who learn pshat that the Shmoshe Rabbah is the same Seder as Rashi, and the difference between Shmoshe Rabbah tefillin and quote-unquote regular Rashi tefillin is the big batim or the small batim. So the Indian to be makbid to have big batim and this kama protim within that beyond the scope, that is Hirol Rabim in Chabad, that we all wear big tefillin. But the tefillin Shmoshe Rabbah to have the parshas, if you say the Shmoshe Rabbah, that's only for the Rabbeim or for Yechidei Skula. The Rebbe spoke about that a number of times. And a third thing in Hilchos Tefillin, which is only Minhag Harav, Minhag Beis Harav, or Minhag of the Rebbe, is also, this is Beferish and Sefer Minhagim, to wear tefillin for Shachris on Tisha B'Av, which is in and of itself a fascinating sugya, and the Minhag Ashkenaz today that we don't wear tefillin for Shachris on Tisha B'Av, but we do wear tefillin for Mincha on Tisha B'Av is it's a fascinating topic in and of itself, how Ashkenazim came to Firzach that way.
Is that all connected to the point we made about being yotze different shittas?
But add some of the Rishonim, there's two shittas. Either you wear tefillin Tisha B'Av or you don't.
Right. So that's why I think it isn't like a bit of like a Yereshimam Yotze D'Shtem where we're not wearing it then. So we're breaking up shar. We invented it's an example of inventing a new anhaga that didn't exist before because we want to side do this, and I think that's why it came to mind.
Just again, it's all very vague in my mind, but if I recall correctly, in that case, wearing tefillin Tisha B'Av Mincha, it's not only Ashkenaz; it also has some interesting inputs from Provence. So,
right. There was something. Okay, there were a few final points I wanted to make. We have to wrap up shortly. One of the points I wanted to say was that maybe we need to create a new Chabad version of the Kaf Hachaim, meaning instead of all the halacha guides that give over, I don't know if that's correct English, but that convey the driest Shabbat. Like I said, the whole mirror discussion is like an example of what irks me, partially because it's like taking the most technical part of it and then creating a new endless technical debate about something where like where's the spiritual dimension of it, where's the ruchnistic havana in it. So maybe what we need is a new Chabad Kaf Hachaim that walks us through the anhagas of the day, but very much articulates and expresses the spirituality behind it. And one more point I wanted to make is about if you're interested in like the tefillin and the ruchnias Shabbat tefillin, one place that comes up a lot by the Rebbe, unfortunately, is by the Shiva. Because I think when maybe in Tafshim Ches, when a lot of Rebbes came, I think the Rebbe maybe for conversation asked many of them what their anhaga is, the Gabi Rebbeinu Tam, I think during Shiva, and there's this nekuda that comes up there about the moichin of Rebbeinu Tam, or whether you can be mamshir those moichin during Shiva. I don't remember the exact pratim right now, but there is definitely this vart of like the discussion about the practical halacha is very much consciously informed by the ruchnias, the spiritual theory behind it. And I think if we told ourselves, but we went back to Chassidus and we reviewed what it says, and then we sort of translated it and told ourselves, or told our mitzvah machrim, that this is the day, this is the moment of the day when you take your, sure, by looking in the Makaritis we can express it in a more articulate manner, but this is the time of the day where we're infusing our moichen, we're infusing our mind and the components of our mind with Elikos, and this is the time of the day to connect our moichen to Elikos. I'm sure there's very sophisticated technical ways of saying it, and I'm sure there's ways to, even Chassidus itself, depending on the Maimer, depending on the Makar, depending on the Sugya, either gets into the technicalities or gives a more general, like even in Tanya, relatively general without getting into major technicalities. If all our discussions about the halachas of tefillin, the details of tefillin, if it was all infused and informed by the spiritual theory behind it, which is very, very, like I said, very present in Chabad. The amount of times in Chassidus where we'll mention the talis and what the talis is doing and what the tefillin are doing, is you just have to tune in. You just have to pay attention to where it is, what it's saying, and to tight your eyes. And I don't remember anyone ever doing this. I haven't encountered it yet. And even though tefillin is such an important part of our lives, both in terms of how it's the center of the bar mitzvah boy, putting on tefillin, v'chulu, or the tefillin controversies that come up. We hear about tefillin all the time. Tefillin is something, as a Lubavitcher especially, you're hearing about tefillin, you're talking about tefillin every day or every other day. We're talking about it so much, so and supposedly we're supposed to have a better spiritual Havana in these inyanim, so why can't our technical discussions with tefillin be more strongly informed and infused with this Havana of what tefillin represents? And like I said, I think it's negeh to all these halachas and all these chumras and all these chashashas. Anyway, to conclude, this is one of the inyanim that the Rebbe Rashab Taka talks about, this tension for those without much hair in the front. There is this tension between a larger bottom and whatever significance that has, versus the chashash and the chumrah of it being in one place. And then the question is, what is gover on what? And even what the Rebbe Rashab says here, apparently, as you pointed out, can be read in slightly different ways. And but it's a very valuable contribution to a topic that you've said has bothered you for years. And so this is an example, a very strongly personal example for you of something that this really came and addressed and clarified. So for the first time, we have the Rebbe Rashab's voice directly on this matter. And similarly, there are a number of other prati halachas, like I said, Ask the Rav already had a number of posts on a number of topics that he was able to update based on these hagais. And there are hagais that are interesting for other reasons. If we had more time, I would probably mention one more. I don't know if we do have the time for it. About
another opportunity.
We'll save it for another opportunity, Mitzvah Hashem. Thank you, Rebbe Rappaport, for graciously taking the time to do this. And hopefully we can repeat this again more regularly in the near future.
Yes, I hope so. All right, thank you, benched.
Yeah, come out, Tom.